All right, our final Tech Track session for today, we'll look at the practical and technical considerations for long-term archiving, various media storage methods, best practices in future catalog monetization. Whether your latest creative work was recorded on analog tape or digitally to a hard drive, preserving your recordings is paramount for future playback. To talk about the how and why of archiving, we're pleased to have with us the Director of Premium Archival Services for Iron Mountain Entertainment, Hillary Howell. And we're excited to bring back legendary engineer-producer Chuck Ainlay for this conversation. And Meg Travis, Director and Global Head of Marketing for Iron Mountain, will be the moderator for this discussion. Please give a warm welcome to our final Tech Tracks panel for today.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. I am the Director of Marketing for a company called Iron Mountain Entertainment Services. We call it IMES for short. And if you don't mind, before we get the discussion started, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to explain why it is that IMES is here, why we care so much about this topic. So it's very possible you've never heard of IMES, and that's okay. But the LA Times recently referred to us as the Fort Knox of Hollywood. And in fact, we are the leading global archival preservation service for the entertainment industry. So we do work with all the record labels, we work with independent producers, engineers, and artists to ensure that both their physical assets, including both tape, film, hard drives, for everything from wardrobe to sets to costumes, through to video footage that's being created every day now, is preserved and stored carefully and appropriately so that down the road, when people go to find it, play it, work with it, and most importantly, monetize it, it's actually available for them to do that. We have locations across the world in digital studios, particularly in Hollywood, a little limestone mine in western Pennsylvania that we call the Underground, Chicago, Toronto, New York, London, and Paris. But most importantly, we've been in Nashville for 21 years. We're very excited to announce that we actually are opening our next digital studio in Nashville in October, so that when we have our clients' assets that need to be digitized, we'll be able to digitize them right on site without those assets ever leaving the facility, which is really important with stuff that's so precious and valuable. So this has become a bit of a mission for us because we care a lot about what we do. We take it really seriously. And in fact, we just recently convened a summit with the producers and engineers wing that we called Protecting Legacies, the Art, Science, and Value of Musical Archives, that included a range of roles and stakeholders all across the industry to bring people together and talk about what we can do to ensure the knowledge transfer to the next generation of this incredibly important art and science that is archival preservation of musical assets. So that's why it's so important that we're here today to us. And I'm here with two wonderful colleagues, Hillary Howell, who is our expert archivist on staff, and also Chuck Ainlay, who needs no introduction. But we're really, really happy to have you guys here to talk about this important issue. So I'm going to ask each of you to start by telling us a little story about a time that you really realized the value of preserving your work.
Well, fortunately, I've never had sort of like it didn't happen moment. So, but I've had a couple of scary moments. One was I was working here in town, and 5.1 audio had started to happen, and so they decided that they wanted to have the Dire Straits Brothers in Arms album mix. So I was asked to come over to England and work with Mark and do the 5.1 mix of Dire Straits. I fly all the way over there. We pull out the tapes. We're supposed to have everything there, and start listening, and there's like a guitar solo missing, and there's vocals missing, and all this sort of stuff. So I said, you know what, you don't have all the assets. You need to go back and look for them. Literally, I went back over a second time, and the nice thing about that, they still didn't have all the assets, but we were able to finish the duet album with Emmylou Harris at that time. And then I went back a third time, and they actually had found them, but they found tapes like in New York, they found them in France, they found them in LA, they were all scattered all over the place.
In
so
basements and closets
yeah,
and attics,
having them all in one place where you know where you can get them immediately is an incredible thing, which at that time, you know, people weren't taking multi-tracks seriously because there hadn't been really a reuse for multi-tracks. But with 5.1 coming around, it was like, okay, these are valuable assets. So now they start thinking that way. And if you look at what's happening right now with Atmos, remixes of your multi-tracks are very important.
Yeah, we never imagined all the applications that you could have for those multi-tracks. Guitar Hero even, you know,
Right.
20 years ago. But Hillary, what about you?
My story has to be a bit anonymous because of NDAs, but I worked for a major motion picture studio that bought a new library that had been owned by a consumer products company that wasn't based in entertainment. And when they bought that library in the 80s, they transferred all the film to 1-inch video because that was what it was at the time. That was the highest level you could get. And then they threw out all of the film. So all of those feature films can now only ever be standard definition, and nothing can ever be done with them to make them look any better. And everyone should learn a lesson from that very horrifying moment when I walked into the vault and found 1-inch videotapes and nothing else for that entire library.
Gosh. Oh my God.
Ouch. On the converse, are there projects that you both have seen where you've been able to realize the benefits of having really well-organized, archived collections, where you've been able to quickly get your hands on something and take advantage of an opportunity?
Kind of caught me off guard.
Sorry, Chuck.
You know, here's just the reality of things. Even though they say they store stuff, it's always
never
hard.
happens.
It's hard to find, and even though we're not actually meant to keep the assets ourselves, I still make a separate backup and keep it anyhow. Don't tell anybody at the label that. And there's been many times when they've actually come to me and asked, where do you have these assets? So
We know you're not the only one that happens to.
yeah,
Yep.
and particularly when you're working with indie artists that you know where you don't have a major label that can afford Iron Mountain, you know, you really have to look after their assets for them. So
Yeah. What about you?
I've worked on a lot of remaster projects, and having to hunt down assets across the globe is never a fun or easy adventure. But luckily, over the past maybe 5 or 10 years or so, people have finally realized how important it is that you keep everything you can from start to finish, at least for a period of time. So that way, when you have to go back and remaster something into 4K or Atmos, or 4K for pictures, Atmos, you can find what you need quickly and get that project done in a timely manner, as opposed to a remaster project taking a year because you're pulling pieces from all over the world, as you talked about with the Dire Straits.
Takes
thing.
a lot more time and a lot more money.
It does, yes. And preservation is an expensive thing. Not gonna lie, but it will truly save you in the end, because you will be able to monetize those assets long into the future, because you'll be able to reuse and remix them.
Along those lines, is there advice that you would give to young artists today who are cutting albums in their bedrooms about how they should be thinking about preserving their work? What's the importance of metadata? How do you advise that they take care of their work now so they can monetize it in the future?
well, first off, I'll just say, write this down. It's spelt out, producersengineers.com. It is the P&E Wings website for the Recording Academy, and there, you just go to recommendations, and there's a whole bunch of different recommendations. But we did a pretty incredible sort of document for delivery, and in that there's a lot of information about how to store, how to back up, how to name things. Naming is so important just at the outset and how you build your file hierarchy. There's a template in there, so before you can just take that template and put it in your Pro Tools or Nuendo or whatever, and build your session within that hierarchy. And if everybody were to kind of follow these guidelines, it would be so easy for the next person down the line to be able to discover what is there. And I think that's from like how to start. That's a really important thing. So naming the hierarchy, and as you're working, always have 2 working drives going. So at least if you had a failure, you'd have a backup of that. And then give it to Iron Mountain.
What do you recommend these days about the cloud versus offline storage? Have you do you have a favorite way of storing your work?
Well, basically I store on hard drive, and I'm always like, I don't use any kind of backup program. Just a full lump copy over, and I always keep a second version. So I just retitle the one that's existing as TBE, and so I know that's the one to erase after I've copied over the second time. So I've just always keep that going, and at least like a couple times a day I back up. And drives are so cheap. You can get large drives, and this really, the expenditure is not huge. So just keep 2 drives going at all times. And I don't really look at things entirely long term, because everything I deal with for the most part gets handed over to you guys, where it goes on to tape backup storage for long term. So
yeah, I will say a cautionary word about storing those hard drives long term, which is that hard drives from the 90s we're finding, what is it, about 80% of them don't boot up from the 90s. There were some manufacturing problems. They were not meant to be stored long term, and so that is definitely something you need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, with audio, there is a consistent problem that there isn't really a great preservation format yet. In the 90s, people relied on DA88s a lot and DAT tapes, and those are never going to last forever. So you have to pay attention to how long you've had something, and you have to consider migration as part of your long-term plan. You have to move those onto new hard drives. You have to, update the version of Pro Tools that those files are part of, because you can't open Pro Tools 7 files these days unless you have all of that software that you've just kept, and most people don't do that.
Rule of thumb basically is 3 years you should migrate to a new drive.
Correct.
So I got a question for you. I mean, nowadays, they're cheaper and they're lighter and easier to ship and everything. The SSD drives or solid state drives. Do you have any recommendations about what kind of solid state drive, or should you not use them, or?
I would use solid state drives over other hard drives. G-RAID drives are always really good. At least we've found, especially with dealing with Avid files and stuff in motion picture. But just always have 2. And once you're done and you have all of that stuff, both of your drives are final, you have all of your files on them. One thing you might want to consider is what we like to call geographical separation, which is where you send one of those hard drives, either you put the things in the cloud, you send it to a vault in another state. I store everything in 2 cities on opposite sides of the country, so that if there is an earthquake and California breaks off of the country, everything is still also in an underground vault in Pennsylvania, where hopefully nothing will happen to it. It's a thing people don't tend to think about, but it just like making 2 copies of everything is vitally important.
Hillary, I'm just realizing I haven't given you a chance to talk about your expertise and your experience. If you would share, because Hillary is the lifeblood of our organization. Can you give a little introduction?
Oh, sure. I've been an entertainment archivist for 15 years. I worked for the Jim Henson Company, Jerry Bruckheimer, Universal, Lionsgate, and now I'm at Iron Mountain. So I've worked with film, audio, video, props, costumes, papers, photography, pretty much anything anyone would ever want to keep. And I've done my best to make sure that they're able to do so forever, as long as humanly possible. So I've done my best to make sure John Wick is preserved for all time. Everyone is welcome.
And Chuck, we're so thrilled that you agreed to be part of this discussion today. Can you talk a little bit about why your passion is in this area, and about your drive to found Meta Alliance in the first place?
Well, I mean, number one, going back to being able to remix a 5/1 album and actually getting a Grammy for that remix, I totally realized the necessity for being able to pull back those assets. But I mean, I also started out very early in the digital age, so I've kind of credited for having done the very first all-digital recording out of Nashville, where it was recorded multi-track digital, mixed digital, and released on a CD. But while I was doing that, we had a 3M 32-track digital tape machine, and there was only one. There was the only one machine in town. There was no way to back it up. And we weren't, I mean, I guess I wasn't smart enough to think that we should be backing up to analog, but we didn't. And this machine was not particularly solid to begin with. But at any rate, we're making this incredible record, and while I'm mixing, it's the 4th of July, and we had the windows overlooking, and you could see the fireworks going off. And I just happened to walk by the tape machine. The tape machine had like an open card cage, and it had these wires hanging out that you could transfer digitally from one channel to another. Well, there was some extra dangling cables there, and as I walked by, my leg brushed the harness, and one of those cables went into the machine and hit the transport control, and the machine went fast forward and rewind all at once and snapped the tape. And I was just freaking out. I was like, what am I gonna do? And we had a 4-track machine, so what I ended up doing was making a copy 4 tracks at a time. And it was, I mean, there was actually no way to synchronize, but we had discovered a way because we were making slaves doing this technique that we kind of just came up with. So I was able to put the song back together, but the worst part of it is in the middle of the night, the artist came in, and she's a very pretty girl, and she came in, and I had said there had been a problem, and she saw the tape that I had to splice out in the trash can, and she just clutched it and started crying and ran out the room. So you have no idea how bad I felt. So right there, that is a reason to back things up and store your assets in a safe way.
So that you don't cause trauma to the artist that you work with.
I think that taught me a really big lesson.
Wow. If we could let's switch to the rise of streaming and, Atmos on Apple. Pretty exciting developments. Where do you see the importance of digitizing analog in that whole, in the new world?
Digitize, it's kind of hard to hear. Digitizing
Analog. So digitizing your catalogs. Have you been actively doing that? Is there a big demand for it?
Well, I mean, analog tape, as we know, it can have a long shelf life, and even if it does kind of end up having some problems. Generally, it can be baked and preserved. Probably want to hire somebody that knows what they're doing when they do that, but it isn't a real difficult process if the tapes aren't in terrible shape. I've had to, I got to remix Peter Frampton's Comes Alive album, and we did the baking and were able to preserve those multi-track tapes and transfer them to digital and work from that. And now, with Atmos, they want to do a whole nother remix of it. So, you know, now that the tapes have been digitized and digitized at high resolution, which I would think would be important too when you're dealing with analog, that we'll still have those assets. The same with Brothers in Arms. We did a high-res transfers of all because even though that album was supposed to be all digital, they had done analog slaves. That was the things that were missing when we were looking for tapes. But we spent a lot of time making sure that we did really great transfers of the analog and digitizing that. Does that answer the question? Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. Did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, so if you do have analog masters, one thing you want to consider is where you're keeping them, because keeping things cool and dry is our mantra as archivists. Humidity will kill your magnetic tapes, and that's why baking is required. And when you bake things, you get one shot at it, and you will never be able to play that tape again. So always sort of consider the conditions you're keeping things in if you are retaining them. Having stuff in your attic is not a great thing overall if you live in a very humid, hot climate. So just one thing to consider with your analog tapes, because yes, they will last a very long time if you take care of them properly.
Ambient Nashville client is not exactly conducive to analog tapes lasting a long time.
Not so much, no.
Yeah. Hillary, can you talk a little bit about the other assets that are created during a recording session? You know, we have in Iron Mountain, sometimes we get lyric sheets and other ephemera that are part of the recording session. What's your view on the value of keeping those things, and how do you recommend people manage that?
I mean, there can be great value to it, because we actually just recently helped a music label. They're working on a 30th anniversary album for a specific record that will be, you know, they'll be re-releasing in the next few years. And we had pulled some assets down because we're working on a project for them. And inside this box, I found a notebook that was just full of handwritten lyrics. And we told them about it, and they asked us to take pictures and send it to them. And now that might end up being part of, you know, the liner notes for this record, because people want to see that stuff. People care about your process. People care about what it took to make the record that you put out. People care about outtakes. People care about the pictures that you took of, you know, your bandmates in the studio just messing around. People care about all of that stuff, and if you can share it with them, they will love that. And especially with, you know, social media being what it is, being able to, you know, to put that stuff up on your Instagram or do any number of things is going to engage that audience with you in a way that just, you know, putting out your album doesn't necessarily do in the same way, because it makes you relatable, and it makes you, you know, it helps them connect, I guess.
We're also seeing, with the rise of NFTs, the ability to repurpose any and all of these artifacts is being very, very valuable to the artists that may not even realize that they can monetize them in this way. So very high resolution scans of lyric sheets, 3D scans of, you know, any special items, you know, even a pen that an artist used to, you know, to write the lyrics to a specific song. All of that is valuable, and all of it should be preserved, honestly.
Well, and just on that topic, I mean, oftentimes I get a session from somebody, and they might have, if they've titled the track, it might say kick, snare, blah, 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 but no mention of who the performer was. And with Sound Exchange, the way we get paid for digital streaming and satellite airplay, musicians get a chunk of that It's not just the artist, it's not just the songwriter. Musicians now get a chunk of that through. So you need to really be including the artist's name when you title a track. And the artist meaning the drummer, the bass player. So you should put that at least in one of, like, so you might have 16 tracks of drums. I always put it on the kick drum, you know, so just so that that name is always there for reference. Just another thought.
Yeah, this is my one preachy moment. I apologize in advance, but metadata is very, very important, as Chuck was just saying. Being able to identify all of the musicians who worked on that album, the engineer, you know, anyone who was involved, and making sure that you understand exactly what, you know, what all 24 of your tracks are or whatever, so that way if you go back and remix things, you know what you're pulling. Keeping track of that information seems like a chore, but it will save you so much trouble in the end.
Someday these streaming services might actually give credits out so that so you can
Amen.
know who played and engineered, and I think it's I mean, they're looking at it. It's just kind of a hard thing for them to incorporate. But just imagine if you like Chuck Ainlay as an engineer and you see my name on a certain record, you might want to like cross-reference that to other recordings, and that will you may end up buying more products. So they're looking at ways to be able to monetize that. So credits are really, really super important. And that's just the simple thing of metadata. There's so much further down the road, you know, that you can go with that.
Perfect. No, we're running a little low on time. Were there any points that either of you feel like you didn't get to make? Now, this is a passion topic for you.
You might have questions out there.
Do we have any questions for our esteemed panelists?
Can't see anybody.
Be brave. I'm scared.
Yes,
Come up
sir.
here.
Right here.
If you're working at home and you're on a computer, print everything, because like you said, if you go back to Logic 7, you can't open it in 10. If you have older programs that you just, you know, print everything you have. If you're home, don't trust that it's going to be kept in the computer. You can change platforms, change versions, change everything. So just definitely.
No, that's really smart advice. In fact, one of the things that we do at Iron Mountain is, we keep every single version of Pro Tools ever made. So if you do have that issue where you don't have that version of Pro Tools anymore, you know who to call. That's one thing we do.
Well, and that's a great point. One thing that I always do when I finish a mix is I consolidate the entire multi-track so that there is like no edits. No, is one consolidated file, all starting at the same point, all ending at the same point for all tracks, so that if it did at some point have to be pulled into some new sort of playback system, you would have the files intact. Yeah, one file per track. I'm not.
Yeah, that what you just said was exactly what I was going to mention, the Grammy standard for file delivery. As I just had a guy come in from California last week, wanted a remix. He had a very old Pro Tools session, so I had 421 1 and 2 measure clips, which, you know, just no way I could mix it. So he has to go back to them, and they'd have to consolidate the tracks. And the studio doesn't exist anymore. It was done on like 7.0 Pro Tools. So the point is, if you have one file per track, all of them starting at 0.1, anybody on any dock can remix it later on. And so that's important for archiving.
Yes.
It's a Grammy standard that Chuck helped set, I don't know, 15
That's a great
years
example.
ago or something.
Very true.
There was one area that I didn't hear mentioned at all, but this might be your business, so I don't know. This is what you're doing here, but on the business side, the corporations use the cloud 100% of all their stuff. Do you have any faith in the cloud? Do you ever utilize the cloud? Do you have any experience with the cloud?
So we're agnostic about where our client's store in many different storage mediums. We do have a nearline, it's a proprietary, highly, highly secure, hack tested every year, never been hacked, nearline digital storage system designed for entertainment content called Smart Vault that actually ingests the file and creates 3 geographically separated copies. One in LA in the offline tape robot, which is accessible via the internet. One in, a second copy in LA, in Hollywood, and then a third copy in the fabled underground, the limestone mine in western Pennsylvania. So we have strong feelings about where you should put your, where you should store, but we know that our clients feel differently about the cloud, and it varies by industry, honestly. We serve the film and broadcast industries and sports industries as well, and different feelings about it. Did you have anything to add?
I have many feelings about the cloud, but I think we're about out of time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for this incredibly generous, insightful panel. That's day 2 of Tech Treks. Thank you for coming out.